I can hear.
Здравейте, колеги! Радвам се, че започва вашия семинар с обсъждането на тази толкова интересна тема за метафоричните изрази в словенски език. Самата аз съм работила с колеги от Университета на Любляна и знам, че те са отлични партньори. Не се съмнявам, че това изследване ще бъде много полезно за нашите два института и ще спомогне за развитието на научните изследвания и ви желая успехи в работата. Успешна работа!
Thank you, Mala.
Hi. After this very nice introduction by Professor Špela Antlога, I'll just introduce Špela very briefly. So we have gathered today on Bastille Day, actually, to hear a very interesting talk on metaphorical expressions in Slovene. And Špela is a research assistant at the Digital Signal Processing Laboratory at the University of Maribor. But she is in fact a PhD student also at the University of Graz in Austria, and her research is based on is focused on language development of language resources and digitalization of technologies for Slovene. Her focus is particularly on metaphorical language and metaphorical expressions in various discourses and the identification of metaphors across in text across registers.
Thank you, Zara, for this nice introduction. And of course, hi to everyone as well. Thank you for attending my talk on metaphorical expressions in Slovene. I would like to apologize to make a small change in my title, but the content of the presentation stays the same. And I'm gonna more or less talk about the corpus I'm building. It's a corpus of metaphorical expressions for Slovene language. And this corpus is called COMET, Corpus Metaphor, so corpus of metaphors. I am not sure if everyone is aware that I'm visiting the Department of Computational Linguistics as a part of Leccia's grant. And for that, I would really like to thank Professor Svetlakova, which managed to, very last minute, arrange everything for me that I was able to come. And of course, all of her colleagues who in the past week have really in detail explained their work to me. They shared their knowledge with me. They also bared with all of my questions and my ideas. And in general, it was so far a very joyful experience for me, also very useful in terms of my future work. So thank you again for hosting me. And since I got to know your institute pretty well, although Zara said some very basic things in her introduction. So as she said, I come from Maribor, and I work as an assistant at the Faculty of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at the University of Maribor, and specifically in the lab that's called Digital Signal Processing Lab. So initially this department is dealing more with language processing, machine translation, speech recognition. So it's very oriented in speech and spoken language. So initially this department, the need for linguists was more in the area of spoken language. But now the group of linguists expanded at our department. And we do not only work on speech resources anymore, but we also switch the focus to other projects that more involve like some digitalization, language digitalization, some other language resources, and it gives me an opportunity to research metaphors as well. So just really in a few words, some of the projects that we are doing at our department. A very recent one is the Slovenia in the palm of your hand. This project ended in 2021, but we are continuing it from September on. And we created an interactive e-learning environment. And the idea behind this is that we don't want just to transform the textbooks into some digital form, but to use as many automatized processes in the process of learning. So basically we would take automated examples from the corpus. We would adapt to the needs of individual user. Like if somebody is doing really well with some exercises, it would automatically skip those lessons and vice versa. So we are going to continue with this project. Then another one that's going to start in September. This is like more of a small project that's financed by the Clarin infrastructure. It's the corpus of parallel idioms. And the idea is to build a parallel corpus for Slovenian English that will be rich with phraseological units, with similes and with metaphors. And it's not a corpus that would be so much used for the linguistic purpose, but more to enhance the performance of the training model for machine translation. This is another one. This is a city of Slovenia from like language resources and technology part of the view. And the project that I'm gonna focus on today, it's the project that basically combines my PhD thesis and work at the Institute. And it's not a fully funded project, but I'm getting funds here and there, like mainly from the Clarin infrastructure. And in a way, it's good because I can work slowly on building this corpus of metaphorical expressions. As you will see, it will probably take me some more time to really finish it the way I would want to. So this would be the outline of my talk today. It basically follows the workflow of building this corpus. So firstly, of course, dealing with the problem of metaphor identification or metaphor extraction. I will present also a brief overview of methods that were used so far for identifying or extracting metaphorical expressions to use. Then I will focus on some of my challenges with annotating these metaphorical expressions. Some challenges come from the fact that there are some limitations to the procedure that I've chosen. And some of them comes from the fact that the annotation scheme and the methodology behind it is that it was made for English. So it's not directly applicable for Slovene or maybe Slavic languages in general. Then I will show you some examples of how this corpus is annotated. It's hand annotated. So it's annotated for 4 different relations to metaphors. It's for indirect metaphor, direct metaphor, borderline cases, and metaphor signals. I will just briefly show you, because that would demand a presentation on its own, but to briefly show you the analysis that I made based on the already annotated data and maybe some remarks for the future work. If you would be dealing with the question how to identify a metaphor or metaphorical expression, you would come across various terms like identification of metaphorical language or identification of metaphorical expressions or metaphor-related words or metaphors or metaphorically motivated expressions, and there are probably more. more terms that would address more or less the same problem. But since there are different approaches to metaphor research, I just want to clarify what I mean when I talk, or why I understood as a metaphor. And I took the definition of Lakoff and Johnson, which state that the metaphor is not something that exists only in language, but it's something that's in human conception, that it's the way of thinking is conceptually structured. And basically that would mean that metaphor is an understanding or an experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another thing. And when concerning the nature of metaphor, they, Lakoff and Johnson, they further say that, okay, the first one is basically the same, that metaphor is primarily conceptual in nature. And then the second one would be more important for my analysis, that the expression that we say it's metaphorical, it's basically just an evidence in language that is in fact realization of a concept in our mind. And C and D would basically mean that complex domain in terms of some simpler, or I'm sorry for this university, and it has already built in the animation, which I could not get rid of. So to illustrate this, I give you an example from my corpus. I have been fighting with gray hair since early 20s. So the metaphorical linguistic expression that shows the underlying conceptual metaphor is fighting, because of course we are not literally fighting with our hair. And that shows that we understand one concept that is called source domain in terms of another concept, basically the other way around. We understand target domains like our body changes in terms of another concept, which is a concept of a battle. And that's called mapping between source domain and a target domain. And like I said before, conceptual metaphors typically employ a more abstract concept, such as body changes, as target, and a more concrete, such as battle, something physical, as their source domain. And if you would look furthermore for some examples, we would see that this mapping between battle and body and or bodily changes is very fighting with eye wrinkles, fighting with satellites, and so on. And this idea that our body is being our enemy, that we have to fight, shows, like a lot of linguistic expression shows that this is something that is very present in our world. And it can also be misused, like in advertising, or employing that somebody who will not deal well with their bodily changes is actually a loser in this battle. There were some critics of this method of conceptual theory, because mainly they have argued that the framework lacks empirical basis. Since like the majority of examples that they were using was just thought of, and it was not something that would be systematically retrieved from a corpus, for example. And this is also one of the reasons that the concept of identification of metaphors became relevant for, of course, for more systematic analysis, for more authentic data and some empirical verification. So I made a quick overview of approaches that were, I would say there were more or less 7 approaches. There were also some experimental work done in between. But these were the approaches that were used to identify or extract at the beginning metaphors from existing corpora. So at the very beginning, identifying was based on manual searching in corpus. So a researcher would carefully read through the corpus and extract the metaphors they would come across. And of course, this approach was very time consuming, and it also drastically limited the potential size of the corpus. But it was, I think it was systematic in a way that nothing was predetermined. So later on, as we will see, in a sense of which expression could potentially be realized as a realization of a metaphor, were predetermined. Whereas in this case, it's similar to approaches nowadays where every expression is taken into consideration. Then another way was searching for source domain vocabulary. As we saw before, source domain for fighting with gray hair was battle. And researchers would make a keyword list of possible source domain, like battle, water, time, spatial orientations, and things like that. And then also expressions, like for example, from fire to heat, heating, overheating, spark, flame, because metaphorical expressions always contain lexical items from their source domain. Otherwise, they would not be metaphorical in the first place. So in the second step, researchers would then identify the target domain in which these items would occur. So they would also identify the metaphorical mappings in which both of the source and target domains occurred. And they also did that for the other way around. So they were searching for target domain vocabulary. This approach would require relatively monothematic texts dealing with the target domain. So let's say if you would have a lot of texts, or we would be interested in this kind of domain, for example, for economy or politics or sports, that would not be such a hard task. But it was harder with target domains like emotions, mental activity, perception, and stuff like that, because it was obviously harder to find text that would be really targeting those domains. Then secondly, it will identify only those source domains that are associated with particular words whose frequency and sufficiently inflated in the target domain text to achieve a keyword status. So basically it would not identify expressions exhaustively or systematically. Then the idea that was relevant for a longer time was searching for sentences containing both items from the source and from the target domain. Of course, like when they started researching source and target domains, they got an exhaustive list of keywords for both domains. There was still some manual work that had to be done, because you could come across examples where both of the words from source and target domain could be used in literal sense. But nevertheless, this was a very fruitful method for identifying and extracting metaphors. So they started to focus on very specific target domains, like before, if it was just economy or sports, they started identifying metaphors in, I don't know, conversation between doctor and patients with cancer, in cybersecurity domain, for speeches of specific politicians and stuff like that. But the majority of research for this was done for English. So the potential keywords for source and target domains were getting longer and longer. But when this moved to another languages, on one hand, of course, it could explain the universality of universalness of metaphors. But if somebody would want to find more culture-specific metaphors or concepts that wouldn't have realization in English, they would, of course, have to start again making their own lists for source and target domain. Another way was to find metaphors was by searching by markers of metaphoricity. This was the idea of Gottlieb. And he discusses a variety of explicit linguistic devices that may signal that the presence of a metaphor. So that would be like metalinguistic expressions like, or so to say, such as in more than one sense, metaphorically speaking. And he also suggests looking for orthographic devices that, for example, quotation marks. I don't know what's the practice. For Bulgarian in Slovene, I know that a lot of people when writing would, if there is a phraseological unit or something that's not in a literal sense, they would use quotation marks in a text. Although like orthographic rules recommend not using that. So if I would deal with text that has been proofread, that would not be a good strategy. But still it was to some extent a good strategy to retrieve at least some metaphorical expressions. With again, some manual work done since those markers are not consistently signalizing the presence of a metaphorical expression. Then another method was extraction from a corpus that was annotated for semantic fields and domains. That was used for articles on Wikipedia. And it's based on the Sullivan's approach, which combines the concepts of conceptual metaphor, frame semantics, and constructional grammar, and that you all know better than me, so I won't get into details of that. And the last one would be, a strategy would be to annotate your own corpus for metaphorical expressions. And this was done by the group of linguists that they call themselves Pragleas group at Amsterdam Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, but the corpus was done for English. So they call it Amsterdam Corpus, and I'm comparing this because this was the idea that I used for annotating my corpus as well. So they took a 4 million word subcorpus of the British National Corpus. They annotated approximately 200,000 lemmas. They used 4 registers: academic text, newspapers, fiction, and conversations. And the corpus is, of course, lemmatized and post-tagged, but the texts were randomly selected from those 4 registers. And my corpus has approximately 120,000 lemmas from a subset of corpus max. So this max corpus was made for the purpose of the project that I talked about before, Slovenia in the palm of your hand, since we needed a corpus to extract examples for the exercises. I used then this corpus as well for annotation of metaphorical expressions. But because of the fact that this corpus was done with in mind that it's going to be used in schools, we had to carefully select what's going to go in the corpus, and that's why I added additional 8,000 lemmas from the news text. And later it also became an idea of annotating transcriptions of spoken language. So adding addition 40,000 lemmas from transcriptions. And the ratio of genre was mimicking our national corpus, that's corpus Gigafido. So what I'm going to talk more about is the identification procedure that the this group used for their corpus, for the Amsterdam corpus at Universiteta. And it's called the MIPW procedure, the metaphorical identification procedure. So they say it's a systematic and transparent procedure for identifying linguistic metaphor. So it does not identify conceptual metaphors. That means it identifies units that have the potential to be realized as metaphors, and that this procedure achieves intercoder reliability. I'm sorry, I have to take a sip because which was actually not relevant for me since I was the only one annotating this corpus. So if you look at the first two bullet points, what this means is that it is annotated for what they call it a metaphorical expression or metaphor related word, which can potentially be a realization of a conceptual metaphor. So following Lakoff and Johnson, by linguistic metaphor, they mean a verbal realization of a concept. And intentionally I stressed verbal because if the idea is that language has just one evidence of our concepts in our minds, then there are also other modes of expressing those concepts, such as visual metaphors, metaphors in gesture, in our mimics, in face mimics, and I also saw some with dancing and music and so on. So if we look at this, this is like from some Slovene company, from their website and their advertising company. Yeah, it's a visual metaphor, of course. And apparently it says that methods that are shipped from the US, in fact, are a baggage that we carry, but also a specific way of advertising with Facebook apparently is slow as a snail. So just wanted to say that language is only one way of identifying this concept. So these are the steps of the MIPW procedure. They're more or less very clear. So first, read the entire text and establish a general understanding of this text, determine the lexical units, and for each lexical unit in the text, establish the contextual meaning it has. Then, basically, if you want to understand the contextual meaning, you have to first determine its basic meaning and decide whether the basic meaning of the word is distant from the contextual meaning. If it's not, you would mark this as non-metaphorical. If it is, then you would have to decide whether the contextual meaning of the word is somehow related to the basic meaning. So it does not mean something completely else. And if it's not, then again, it's not metaphorical, or at least it doesn't have the potential to be realized as a metaphor. And if it is, then you would mark this lexical unit as metaphorical. So I will go quickly through those steps and tell you the challenges I had when applying this for a Slovene language. So the first step was relatively easy and I had no problems with that. Then the second step determined the lexical units in text and discourse. Then the problem started. As the decision made at this step of the procedure might have some significant consequences on the quantitative aspects of the analysis, I thought that it is very important to establish some clear rules for this lexical segmentation. And according to MIPW, this procedure, the basic unit of analysis is a lexical unit, which usually corresponds to an orthographic word, except for multi-word units, such as phrasal verbs and polywords. as for the compounds and proper nouns consisting of more than one word, there has to be primary stress on the first word in order for them to be treated as single lexical units. So why was that problematic for Slovenia? One problem is that phrasal verbs do not exist in Slovenian, or at least they're not comparable to the definition of what a phrasal verb is in English. For example, to look up or to carry out something, we would use a prefix pogledati, dokončati. But we could say that something similar to this rule would be reflexive verbs, so verbs with particle se. And they would be a candidate for the status of the non-decomposable lexical units. Also some examples of verbs with prepositions. So my rule was that the reflexive verbs should not be split for the analysis, since these verbs often display meanings that are completely different from their non-reflexive pair. For example, nadevati, to fill in, and nadevati se would have a completely different meaning, but only one meaning, and that would mean to get drunk. And following the procedure, since it's the only meaning, the contextual meaning obviously cannot be different than the basic meaning, so that would actually not be annotated as metaphorical. But on the other hand, for example, zaplesti and zaplestise, which would mean zaplesti, make something with knitting, and zaplestise to become irregularly entwined, or the other meaning would be to get involved with somebody, zaplestises con. And of course, this meaning, if the contextual meaning would be the second meaning, that would be marked as metaphorical. Like I said, the procedure additionally specifies the rule for treating compounds, which are spelled as two different units in English. And they say if there is primary stress on the first word, they are to be treated as a single lexical unit. Such as secondary school or power plant. But in the case of following stress patterns, researchers should mark each word as separate unit, such as nuclear power. And this stress criteria was hard for me to understand, because Slovenia, in Slovene, both elements of the compound would bear equal stress. So I would analyze each of the two components separately. In some cases, however, adjectives can be formed from such word combinations, which would show some greater semantic unity of the components, where the first component is modifying the meaning of the second, such as primary school, osnovna šola, and then the adjective would be osnovnošolski. And there are more examples like this. So in that case, I would consider them lexical units. I forgot about the previous criteria. When it comes to multi-word expressions and dealing with English, the analysts were told to, or advised to, use the British National Corpus for the list of such fixed expressions, but such list unfortunately doesn't exist for Slovene. So when determining the multi-word expressions, I was following the criteria of fixed word order and the presence of this item in the dictionary. So if they're not codified in the dictionary, I consider them as novel formations, and for that to be treated as separate lexical units. The problem is that the dictionary is not very up to date. I think the last book of the dictionary was made by early 90s. So when I was talking to some other researchers, they suggested to maybe check this in the corpus as well, not only depend on the criteria of being in the dictionary, but that also was in my head a bit problematic, because if I'm using a dictionary to determine a basic meaning, then to stay consistent, I would actually have to use corpus to determine the basic meaning of the contextualized word as well. So I decided to stick with this criteria that it is notified in the dictionary. So the third step was to decide whether the contextual meaning is different from its basic meaning, and that it's sufficiently distinct. And the criteria for sufficient distance is provided in that case. So it says that only senses which are listed as separate numbered entities following the same head word are to be regarded as sufficiently distant. And yeah, during my analysis, it became clear that such rigorous application of this rule would be impossible because in the dictionary for Slovene contemporary language, a basic and non-basic sensor are often combined under the same head. Like here, for example, you would see they're divided by either one dash, which would mean a sub-meaning, or by two dashes, which would be not a sub-meaning, but a somehow showing that the meaning is a bit different, but not exactly a sub-meaning. So while the existence of this separate numbered senses is a criteria in regarding senses to be distant enough, I think it's still like a task of an individual to decide whether such numbered senses are indeed sufficiently distinct. And therefore, I take into account that contextual and basic senses are not necessarily be separated by numbers. It's not a major departure from this original MIFU method. I think it only highlights the need for caution when dealing with languages that are not as lexicography developed as English. Yes. One example of that would also be some deverbal nouns or deverbal adjectives, because these lexical units are defined through the meaning of the verb that they derive from, and they do not always have a separate entry in the Slovene dictionary. And again, I would not have an information whether the meaning was derived from the basic meaning of the head or of some of the other meanings. And the same actually goes for adverbs. So in those cases, I would rely on my instinct, whether the contextual meaning of the adverb, let's say, is derived from the related non-basic meaning of the word, and then mark this as a borderline case. Another problem that I was also facing is that Slovene, and I guess also all Slavic languages, have a more complex morphological system than English. In the cases where the procedure in English would be suggesting metaphoricity, in Slovene, it's being encoded in either a prefix or its case encoded. So it would be expressed through a certain case. For example, to step into the dark, we would use a prefix, but in the English scenario, that would be marked as metaphorical. And to believe in someone, we would say to believe someone, not in someone. We would use dative for that. So Those cases for now have been overlooked, but noted to examine if they if they will potentially be annotated as metaphorical, and I will decide on that later. Oh, that's another example. So to lead to something, we would use dative for that. So I mentioned this at the beginning. I annotated for relations to metaphor, and that would be a metaphorical related word that's it's in indirect relation to metaphor, that's indirect relation to metaphor, something that is called metaphor signalizer, that it's signalizing that the metaphorical expression is it's announcing the metaphorical expression, and borderline cases. So indirectness would actually mean mapping one concept from another, like we saw before. I couldn't listen to him anymore since he was already bombing me with his ideas, and that would be marked as indirect metaphor-related word. Another label would be metaphor-related word that's direct, and in that case, the target domain is actually in its basic meaning, because if you're behaving like a hungry pigeon, pigeon is actually in its basic meaning. It's the mapping occurs in that's directly expressed, not indirectly. And that is also signalizing, like the word caught, like, equal to, metaphorically speaking, literally. These are the metaphorical signals that would indicate that the metaphor is present. And some borderline cases, when I couldn't decide if the contextual meaning of the word is used in a basic sense or a non-basic sense. For example, dotakniti se. So it's a football player is giving a statement after the game. And immediately after the game, this young player touched on his sore muscles. So dotakniti se, to touch on, is actually a phrasal verb in English, and it means to speak about, but in Slovene, dotakniti se could mean he was talking about the game, and he was talking about the sore muscle, indicating that the game was really hard, or he was actually physically touching his muscle because he was in pain or something like that. So there were quite a few cases of like that I couldn't decide, and I would mark that as borderline case. So the MIPU procedure stops there, but for the purposes of my analysis, I also added a frame tag, and this would actually be a tag of a source, something that would relate to a source domain. So for example, I couldn't listen to him anymore since he was already bombing me with his ideas, would get a frame tag war. I additionally decided that it would be good to add a target domain as well, but that has not been implemented yet. But the information of the target domain, let's say here, conversation or communication, would also later on be labeled. I won't go into details because I want to show you the analysis that I've done on the data that so far has been annotated. So I made an exhaustive list of all the frames that were used in the news genre. And so these are all the frames. It's moving. It goes from the most frequent frames to the least frequent frames, from moving to body, extension, time, battle, and so on. And I would give a list of the linguistic expressions that were used for a specific frame. For example, this is an example for war frame. So on the left, there are examples, then the target domain. And I would also make a scenario. Let's say that if the target domain is war, and if the frame is war and the target domain is emotion, from the data, I would see that scenarios would be to be in a relationship with somebody is like being in a battle with somebody. And that the opponent in the battle is either the other person who is speaking, or an individual can be an opponent to himself. So I would describe these scenarios based on the linguistic realization. And also would try to find, connect them to the function that specific frame is evoking. So that functions would be like whether this the expression is evoking some descriptive function, or it's an evaluation of something, or if it's convincing somebody, if it's evoking emotions, if it's used for manipulation, if it's maybe just an automatism because it's some conventionalized expression. And I think, yeah, so that's it. So for the future work, one thing that I haven't talked about is the level of metaphoricity, which is also now becoming a very relevant topic, because obviously not all expressions are metaphorical, have the same metaphoricity. So maybe if needed, that it's something also to take into consideration to mark the level of the metaphoricity. Maybe after being here and talking with some of you, it was proposed to, and I think it was a good advice to look further into the frame semantics, the elements of frame semantics, which I think is like somewhere similar to what I was doing in describing the scenarios, but to have more systematical annotate that, I think that would be very useful for me. Another idea also that came from this visit here was to pay more attention of metaphorical units rather than just on the interpretation. And investigate more is WordNet, which I will, I promise. So thank you.